Hello again. Thank you for joining me for a few more words of truth and reason. As you can see, I can again video outside as almost all the snow has melted here in late spring in Fairbanks, Alaska. In the last video, we looked about the truth, looked at Jesus being the truth and the evidence for that. And remember that Jesus does not appeal to blind faith or subjective experiences or man-made religion as the basis for your allegiance, your persuasion, your belief in Him. Jesus wants you to investigate the evidence for the claims that He makes, such as, I am the truth, as well as the claim, as He said in John chapter 10, I am the resurrection. What about His resurrection? If that is true, then Jesus really is the truth and the life. And so what would persuade someone to believe something like that today? Well, to investigate what happened 2,000 years ago, what kind of evidence is even available? And I want you to notice that that evidence actually began before His resurrection. Now, how could that be the case? Well, first of all, consider that God as the source of life is an important part of the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. In Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 4, it is said, for every house is built by someone, but He who built all things is God. Think about the claim, the teaching of the Bible, that God is the source of life. Now, what evidence and what explanation, what observations have you made about the source of life? I believe you're just like me, that everything you have ever seen and observed and learned from your own study leads to the conclusion that life comes from life, and you are evidence of that. So what other options are there? Well, many scientists are searching for, and maybe some are hoping for, life coming from non-life. But if we even take a scientific approach, the scientific method would prove that life comes from life. There's no observation, there's no experiment, there's no study that has ever shown that life could possibly come from non-life. So, starting with that point, resurrection is reasonable. If life comes from this mighty being who gave the gift of life on earth, then that being would certainly have the power to give life to a dead body. So that doesn't prove the resurrection, but I'm just showing that's a part of the evidence for the resurrection. Secondly, in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, the evidence that God has spoken, that's another part of the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Hebrews 1, verses 1 and 2 says that God in time past spoke to the fathers by the prophets, and in these last days He has spoken to us by His Son. Whether you're reading the Old Testament or New Testament, God has never spoken to everyone. God has consistently, in fact, spoken to just a few who were called the prophets, and then they had the duty to sometimes write that word or go and speak the words that were spoken to them. Now, anytime someone would claim to be a prophet, they needed evidence that God had actually spoken to them. And so God did that in various times and in different ways. So Scripture is the record that God has spoken, and Scripture has the evidence that God has spoken. We looked at some of that evidence in the previous video. Jesus as the source of truth. We looked at several examples of statements that were made that could only possibly be fulfilled in the life of Jesus Christ. And then we saw that that's exactly what happened. So fulfilled prophecy becomes the evidence that God has spoken, and anyone who has spoken we certainly know exists. Now, consider a couple of prophecies related to Jesus' resurrection. In Psalm chapter 16 and verse 10, the writer David expresses his hope concerning his own death. That he says, my flesh will rest in hope. But then he goes on to say, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. Your Holy One will not see corruption. David was certainly not talking about himself, because he had just stated that he knew he would die, and yet his flesh would rest in hope. Now, we'll combine that with About 250 years later, a prophet named Isaiah wrote in Isaiah chapter 53 that God would send his servant who would die as an offering for sin. So putting these statements, these teachings together, God's servant would die, but his servant would not see corruption. How is that possible? Well, those naturally fit together, easily fit together when you consider Jesus dying and then being bodily, physically resurrected a short time later. 3 days later, Christ arose. 3 days later, Christ was providing the evidence that God had spoken. Jesus was providing the evidence that I am the resurrection and the truth. Now, in the next video, we'll look at more information, more evidence from the events surrounding Jesus' resurrection. So please join me for that one. You can see the sunshine is coming in behind me and even affecting the video quality, but maybe the resurrection of the sun on another day is a fitting end to these words of truth and reason.